Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deirdre Logan, and I'm a project associate here at the Implementation Science and Practice Advances Research Center. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar featuring Drs. Melissa Anderson and Alexander Wilkins. They're going to be presenting Increasing Therapy Usability for Deaf Sign Language Users. Before we get started with the actual webinar, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Just so you know, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on iSpark's website along with the slides. If you're calling in over the phone, please remember to use your unique audio PIN. We are offering captioning services for the webinar. I just sent out the link in the chat box if anyone needs it. If you are experiencing any audio problems, you can check your settings in the Go to Webinar Audio tab on the dashboard. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email me, the organizer, at deirdre.logan@umassmed.edu or use the questions tab in the Go to Webinar dashboard. And then we will be having a Q&A session after the presentation. We're going to ask that if you have questions that you send them in through the questions box, and you can send them in as you think of them rather than having to wait till the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Anderson, and I'm a psychologist here at UMass Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts. That's part-time. The other part, I do provide therapy for deaf people, as well as doing research on how we can improve our approach when we are counseling deaf folks and ASL users.
Hello, good morning or afternoon, I guess. My name is Alex Wilkins. I am a postdoctoral fellow here at UMass Medical School in Worcester. And like Melissa, I do some of my work in clinical and some in research.
So today's agenda, we really have 4 items that we'll be discussing. The first is to talk about who the clinical population is, and we will go into what that means a little more in depth. The second is to discuss what are the common barriers to treatment for that population. The third is where the current state of the field is for deaf mental health, what has been done and what has not been done yet. And then the fourth are the barriers that are in place and how we can overcome those.
So I'm going to start with talking to you about who the population is. We're going to be focusing on the deaf community in the United States, of which there are more than 500,000 individuals who communicate using sign language. We don't have exact numbers, but we're looking at people who use a unique language, a shared language. They have a shared culture, including art, and you know, it's not necessarily the focus of hearing loss, but the focus is more linguistic and cultural. You can see here a couple of pictures, examples of deaf art. You see a group of people at a table communicating in sign language. And beneath that, you have an example of an older view of deafness, including old terms like deaf and dumb, hearing impaired, hearing loss, as opposed to more of a cultural view of deaf identity. And then you see in this piece, it includes the terms deaf, deaf blind,
hard of hearing.
Yes, right, hard of hearing, signer, and those are more current culturally appropriate terms. Through the years, there has been a history of oppression from the hearing majority against people who use American Sign Language, and there has been some opposing views on whether or not people should learn to speak or be able to use sign language. Back in 1880, there was a conference in Milan where it was determined by people who can hear, so not members of the deaf community, that deaf people would be educated and with a focus on oral language or speaking rather than sign language. So there have been a lot of barriers to access to information because of this and other things.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, there are huge disparities in behavioral health for deaf people. There's an increase in mental health conditions and substance use disorders. For example, there's a 2 to 2.5 times more likelihood of mood and anxiety disorders compared to the general population. For trauma exposure, it's 2 times, and problem drinking is 3 times compared to the general population.
Okay, so now I will go into more of the piece about what the common barriers are for this population to access treatment. So, like Alex just mentioned, deaf folks, their language is primarily American Sign Language. And of course, that is here in the United States. Every country has their own sign language, but in the United States, we do use ASL. So the number of therapists, psychologists, social workers who are actually fluent or can sign is very few. That means that most deaf folks who want to go to therapy have to see a hearing therapist or a non-deaf therapist, and it's up to that therapist if they're willing to bring in a qualified interpreter. Even though an interpreter is required by law, the Americans with Disabilities Act does require that. Unfortunately, due to willingness to provide the service or lack of funds, sometimes and most times a certified interpreter is not present. What's really important too is that the interpreter brought into these situations is very qualified and knowledgeable within the field of mental health. It is a very special type of certification. Not all generalist interpreters have those skills. I do want to emphasize that written English is not a deaf person's first language. ASL or a signed language would be their first, and then written English is acquired as a second language. So it might be helpful for you to think about this group as a second language learner, or, a population who's learning English as a second language. Also, there are many deaf people who have experienced language deprivation. And I will explain that a little more in depth because you may not be familiar with that term. But so 90 to 95% of deaf children are born into hearing families. And those hearing families generally do not know sign language. So those children are growing up in an environment that they're not able to access just environmental learning and acquisition that way. And so sometimes they're not learning language until the age of 4 or 5 when they're school age, and accessing it in a different way because they haven't had that auditory piece up until that point. Research shows that from 0 to 5 is the most important period in a human's life for language acquisition. The brain is just ready to acquire language. And so if during those 5 years a child is not exposed, deaf child is not exposed to any type of language, it leads to cognitive issues, social, emotional issues, and language issues in the future. We will show a short video to help better explain this situation and what language deprivation is.
And if you don't mind, I just wanted to add, we do have now the newborn hearing screening test which has been implemented since the early 90s. I forget if it was 91 or 92. Before that, there were a lot of children whose hearing loss went unnoticed. Oftentimes, the parents were not aware that their child was deaf or hard of hearing until they were 3 or 4. So with the newborn hearing screening test, that allows us to know earlier for a lot of deaf kids.
So here's the video. Okay, now that this is wrapped up, I hope that really drives home the point to help you realize that language as a foundation is crucial to future development. It helps with cognitive development, social development, mental health, the list goes on. So one truly important point to consider is that when a deaf person comes for therapy, part of their history could be this language deprivation. We don't know how long, it depends on the individual, but it could be a longer time without language versus less time. But considering that is going to influence the consequences that that they bring throughout the rest of their life and some of the mental health situations you may see. Another point to consider is that many deaf people show very low health literacy, very similar to non-English speaking U.S. immigrants. We see the levels very similar between those two populations. I think this quote really drives it home. So many adults deaf since birth or early childhood do not know their own family medical history, having never overheard their hearing parents discussing this with their doctor. So this means that really growing up, these children are missing out on their own family's history, medical or otherwise. They don't know what they're at risk for genetically, generationally, the vocabulary to describe what they're going through. So that's a big problem. Another important consideration, like I just said that most therapists who are available are non-deaf, not part of the community or the culture, and they're part of the majority oppressor group. So as a hearing therapist who's part of the majority, I myself am a hearing psychologist, but it's important for me to recognize that fact and to really, understand my privilege when I'm working with my deaf clients. So if I don't recognize this with my deaf clients, I run the risk of increased mistrust, fear. Could be that my deaf client, can't find another therapist, though they want to, which means there's a higher risk of them not seeking help. And especially for hearing people working with deaf clients, we really need to recognize that even though I am trying my best not to be oppressive to my deaf client, there is a history there. And that is just intrinsic in the process, and it's going to be there.
And this, too, is similar with other majority-minority groups. So, for example, if an African-American client is seeing a white therapist, you would see this same sort of power differential because of that history of oppression.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it.
All right, next we're going to talk about where we are now in the field, what we've done so far. In the field of psychology, we talk about evidence-based treatments, and those are approaches, maybe you have heard of CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. They're approaches that have been researched formally, and they have been found to have results, positive results. Currently, in the behavioral health system, we are shifting to using EBTs more and more because basically they're more likely to be funded. State contracts, for example, require us to use these approaches that have already been found to work. And as I mentioned, CBT is just one example. You can see here on the slide a list of other examples of EBTs, which is an alphabet soup, more or less.
And again, it's important to emphasize that these have been tested on a hearing population.
Right, exactly.
A general hearing population.
Yes. And also to add to that, evidence-based treatments are studied on not only a hearing population, but also typically white, able-bodied. So it does provide a bit of a dilemma.
Yes. So it's often that type of bias we see in the research as well.
So again, the EBTs are usually a combination of talk therapy with workbooks or handouts, maybe like a take-home workbook or handout or forms that you do during the session. And on the slide here, you'll see some examples. Again, these assume that a person is fluent in English, able to write and express themselves in English, able to read English and understand it conceptually and apply it as a new skill.
And I should have mentioned this before when I was talking about acquiring English as a second language. There's not a lot of research about this topic. However, what we do know is that deaf high school graduates are on about an average 4th grade reading level when they graduate. Hearing high school graduates are about at 6th grade reading level on average. So it's not too far behind, but it is behind. And so that is another consideration for us to think about when we're working with these clients as they're reading capabilities.
Okay. So the handouts and the workbooks typically include some sophisticated language and strategies. So for example, there might be scales for determining your mood, and they might use some sort of high-level words like misery, for example. There's a lot to think about when assessing your mood. There's often a lot of psychological jargon being used. There are many assumptions that are being made based on a hearing person's experience or hearing norms. Concepts like, sometimes do you hear things but you don't know where they're coming from? And a deaf person might not have the background knowledge to understand what is being assessed. So a deaf person, might actually hear something but not know where it's from, and it isn't necessarily getting at a hallucination or a delusion. So there could be a lot of misunderstanding there.
Definitely.
And what's available now really is not suitable for working with the deaf community based on their unique language and cultural needs. Like we mentioned, limited understanding of English is one problem. Not really meeting the needs of deaf linguistically or culturally is another.
Okay, so we have a few people in the room with us. So we're going to ask you guys, pop quiz. In your opinion, how many evidence-based therapies have been developed and evaluated with deaf individuals? You guys want to take a guess?
0, we have someone saying.
Oh, another 0 back there, okay. Thoughts? All right, one, no idea. All right, but you are correct. 0 is the answer. So far, people have really, recently, we've started to try to adapt and develop things for the deaf community, but historically that has not been true. So the answer is 0. We will explain a little bit more later about what our current efforts are in developing some evidence-based treatments and therapies, but at the moment it's 0.
Right, unfortunately, that's true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I want to talk about how we can try to overcome these barriers that we've described. Linguistic barriers, knowledge barriers, cultural barriers, and how we can get past that. So I will have some different examples in this section about a few of the efforts that are in place to develop some behavioral therapies, evidence-based therapies, and so we'll share that with you now. And it's not just our work, but others as well. So this slide is very basic, just a summary of, what you think about when you're adapting EBTs. Original materials are usually pretty heavy, English-based materials, and so the key would be to truly simplify things. Plain text, simple principles. If the English still doesn't fit your client, then an ASL translation would be better. There are different ways to accomplish that, videos or live interpreting. Also, making your own materials that include deaf norms, deaf culture, deaf values. We'll give some examples later as well. And then the fourth piece is really to acknowledge the history of oppression. It's in the room. So if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to build that trust and rapport with your client. So there are 7 different principles on how to adapt for your deaf clients. And what I feel is most important, in my own opinion, is really adapting the language. We don't want to give the impression that all deaf signers are the same. The community varies widely. Some deaf people are born into deaf families, are given language from day one. Others acquire sign language later. Some use a sign system that is more similar to English, but it's not a true language. There really is a variety out there. So it's really important to individualize the communication with whoever you're with and match their needs.
Yes. And some deaf people maybe are hard of hearing and they use some hearing, whether it's through an implant or hearing aids, and they might not be fluent in American Sign Language. So really we have to consider all types of deaf people.
True. So this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that is hard when we're trying to develop one manual or one toolkit to match all deaf people. That's a challenge. And often, if there is very lengthy, English text, we try to either simplify it or replace it with American Sign Language. Try to add visuals and pictures, videos, whatever you can use to match that person's learning style as well. Here's an example. So this handout has been adapted from an approach called Cognitive Restructuring, and this is for PTSD specifically. So this paper would help a person to identify negative thoughts and then how to parlay that into what they're feeling in their body, and then to give them the ability to adjust and restructure those thoughts and become more positive thinking. So you can see that the same approach is here, but with added pictures and visuals. You can see the top left box here. So that picture does include signs, and it's saying what happened. So we're adding some ASL linguistic content here as well. And if you look at the third box on the top, it says negative thought what? And so for you English speakers, that might sound really funny and grammatically incorrect, but the word order actually fits ASL grammar and structure. In English, this would be, what is your negative thought? Or what are your negative thoughts? But in ASL, this is matches the ASL grammar and matches a deaf consumer in that way. So principle number 2. We had talked about low health literacy in deaf clients, and then there's another term, FOI, which is fund of information. So if you imagine a hearing baby or a child growing up, they're able to environmentally acquire information that's happening around them. They're overhearing conversations. They're listening to the TV, or the radio is on in the background. There's a plethora of places they could be picking this up. But in this instance, they're sponges. When a deaf child goes out into the hearing world, there's not a lot of linguistic content to access. So that limits their fund of knowledge. They're not picking up as much incidentally. So some specific information that we would expect most people to know and common knowledge can be missing. They can be huge gaps for these deaf clients, just because they haven't been explicitly exposed to it. One example, when I was in graduate school, I did a research study about domestic violence. And I was asking people about their experience within their relationship. And, yeah, I said, in the past year, has your partner hit you or kicked you, spit at you, swore at you, insulted you, and I went through the litany of behaviors. And then I did add one question at the end and said, in your opinion, is that person abusing you? Many people who had said yes to all of the behaviors, so yes, they hit me, they choked me, they did all these things, then later answered that question about, is this abuse, in the negative. They said no. And so one interpretation of that is that to say that even though they've experienced these behaviors, this person does not understand that those behaviors equate to abuse and that abstract concept in English. So trying to figure out what this client knows and what they don't know and finding those gaps is, and then helping to educate them is important part of this work as well. And it's not just to sit there and become a professor and preach at them, but to provide resources instead to help them fill in their own gaps. So this example is from our current work. I know it's probably small and not able to be read easily as we're showing it here, but I will explain it. This is like a questionnaire to help the client understand, is my relationship safe or not? Is this a healthy or an unhealthy relationship? So again, going back to the research that I had done and finding out that a lot of people in the deaf community are experiencing abuse but not able to label it as such. This was developed as a way to help them understand that. The third principle is to use storytelling, to leverage storytelling as much as possible. It's a natural part of the deaf community and the deaf culture. And it is how the deaf community passes down their literature and stories. It's an oral tradition, basically. So video work and recorded work is how the deaf community passes down their culture and their heritage. And so it's a natural part of their community, and so to use that is impactful. On the left, you'll see there's 5 people standing together. This is actually from an effort here at UMass. Those are all people who have identified themselves as being in recovery. And they all produced their own vlog together just to talk about their own recovery and their own recovery stories, just to raise awareness of mental health in the deaf community. The second picture you'll see is a visual representation of a metaphor. So the mountain is supposed to represent the process and the journey of recovery. And you see 2 people on this mountain. One that says few. On the side, we've got a direct path to the top, and then the other with a more winding path to get to the summit. Some twists and turns and ups and downs, a little more challenging. So this is the type of visual metaphor to incorporate in your work as well, because it does make things more clear and explicit. Principle number 4 is to teach through examples. So, like I just mentioned, if a client doesn't know what abuse means and you ask them, have you experienced abuse or trauma? Their answer is going to mean nothing because they don't understand the meaning of the word itself. So giving examples is going to be hugely beneficial. More concrete examples will aid the process.
Yes, there might be situations where a person is very attached to a particular sign for the meaning of a concept. So, for example, there are different signs for drugs. one that is more general and one that's more specific. So if you use a specific sign, the person might think you're implying a drug that's IV, an IV drug. And so they might answer no if you ask, do you use drugs using that sign, whereas they do use other drugs.
Yes, and similar with the sign for abuse. It kind of looks like somebody being hit, but we know that there's different types of abuses. So spelling the word instead would be more effective, but, you know, this one sign could mean just physical abuse, and their answer could be, no, I don't experience that. But, of course, we know there's emotional and various other types of abuses, so wanting to make it clearer so that it incorporates all. The other way to use examples is to actually get the client to give you examples. So when you're listening to this person, maybe mentioning, you know, say, oh, so when you're out, you know, taking some time on a walk, that's a coping skill. So pulling from their experience to add a concrete example to help them understand the abstract concept. This is another example, and it's a way it is meant to be used during treatment. So the red flags mean, you know, kind of on a downhill trajectory, but the green flags are, you know, that things have turned around and are becoming better. So, you know, using their own examples to fill in the bubbles, you know, so feeling isolated or lying or, you know, not feeling physically well, if that's their experience, getting them to mention it and filling out the paperwork with them so that they understand from their own life experience what we're talking about. The fifth principle is to try to use more activities. And this isn't unique to just the deaf population. There are many hearing people who would also benefit from the same type of activities and approaches and strategies. If, you know, you're sitting there for an hour just talking, some people love it, some people get bored and disengage. So hands-on activities are a great strategy for any practice, really. But it's something to do together. You can do educational games, role-playing, whatever you do, just make sure that it applies to the discussion and the topic at hand. So this is an example from our current video series that we are making. And so this, what it's saying is, yeah, now we will practice physical grounding, so copy me. So the therapist in the video is telling the person to copy them, meaning they're going to do it together. Principle 6 is to take advantage of technology. We are very lucky to have so much technology at our fingertips. You know, there are apps to track mood, to help with expression and art, and so there's also ASL videos available. These are two videos that I wanted to recognize in particular. They're from the Wellness Center in Rochester, the Deaf Wellness Center in Rochester, New York. Excuse me, Trevor. So those are two applications of DBT, DBT skills in particular. So radical acceptance, and the second is opposite action. So those two terms you may or may not be familiar with. They are popular terminology from DBT. And in Rochester, they made these two videos with deaf folks in mind.
So there are two things going on in these adaptations. There's translations into ASL, but there's also more narrative or storytelling approach as a way to teaching these DBT skills. I do really like this approach. And for those who don't know, DBT is Dialectical Behavior Therapy. It is integrating behavioral skills with different self-assessments of your mood, whether, you're thinking about your past and how it applies today. And kind of in a nutshell, that's what DBT is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the last but not least, Principle 7, is to use peer-to-peer approaches. So the deaf community, members of the deaf community often feel burdened to help each other and accountable to help each other. And so leveraging those relationships, finding a peer specialist or a coaching program. Here in Massachusetts, we are very lucky to have both deaf peer specialists that are in a paid role under the Department of Mental Health. Also, we have deaf recovery coaches, and there's a deaf recovery coach program. And so we are very lucky to have access to these very valuable resources. So it's possible you could help your client to connect with some of these resources, to find some support. If there isn't anything available in their area immediately, there could be some online resources as well. There is an ASL grief support group that has recently been set up online. There's also online drug and alcohol support groups for deaf individuals in particular. So there's a lot of resources to be connected to. Okay, so I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure that we have enough time left for any questions. So I do have one more video to show. This is from a new approach that we are creating here called Signs of Safety. A very brief description is it's related to trauma and addiction treatment. And this is a deaf-friendly toolkit to use with those clients. So this is incorporating all 7 principles into one approach. There are 12 altogether in the series of videos that we have. It's like psychoeducation soap opera, if you will. And so hopefully you enjoy watching it. So this is number 9 of our videos. And it might be that some information is missing just because it's been in previous videos, but I hope you enjoy. Okay, so see the credits, the list of names. It really just shows that this project took a village to get going, and you know, it's been since 2013, so it's really been a great effort. But the point is to really put those 7 principles, deaf-friendly therapies, into place when you're working with deaf clients. So adapting the language, you know, addressing the fund of information, deficits, leverage storytelling, using examples, using active strategies, leveraging technology, and using those peer-to-peer approaches with deaf peers. So now I see we do have a little bit under 10 minutes left, so we'd like to open it up to any questions.
Thank you very much. That was a great webinar, very interesting. And if folks did have issues watching the videos, when we post the recorded webinar, we will insert the actual video so that it won't be choppy like it might have been. And I apologize for that. Let me see. If you do have questions, please type them into the questions box. And let's see. So someone was wondering if there is a way for the ASL, how to be ASL community friendly to connect inquiries with local providers. Is there anything you could offer about that?
I guess it would depend on, I'm hoping I understand the question right, first of all, but it does depend on where you're located. So in some states, they do have a commission for the deaf. So my recommendation would be that if that situation does arise, where you cannot find ASL resources on your own, to reach out to your state's commission for the deaf and hard of hearing. It could be that your state has local interpreting agencies, independent living agencies, a variety of different agencies and organizations that would focus on deafness and the deaf community. So I'd say, yeah, hopefully the state has resources you can reach out to first, but if not, those others would work as possible consults. And if that didn't answer your question specifically, please restate it and send another question back in, and we'll try to answer that.
So someone was wondering, are there any adaptations to assessments such as risk, substance abuse, intake, etc., that are available?
Not really, is the short answer. Assessments with deaf and hard of hearing clients is more problematic even than therapy. I mean, there are tests that people typically use, but the standards for those tests are sort of thrown out the window as soon as you start using it in sign language, a different language than it was normed to. Mm-hmm. So there's some things in development, but the short answer is no.
There's one recent project by researcher Deborah Guzman, she's the interpreter, and
it was a 5-year grant through NIDLR, and this was for the purpose of developing accessible assessments in sign language, specifically for vocational rehab. There are a few tests within that battery that focus on alcohol or drug use, and I do believe that they are now available online. if you have an interest in finding that information, please feel free to email us and we can send that along to you.
This may kind of be a follow-up to that, but is there a way to access those adapted CBT guides?
Yes, so if you're talking about the signs of safety, which I think you may be referring to that, right now we are running a small clinical trial and a research study just to make sure that the materials are safe, effective. And so when we have enough data collected to know the safety, to know that we're not harming people, triggering people, and causing them to become worse, then we will be posting those online, and that'll be free for public use. But we're still in the process of collecting data to make sure it's safe, but then it will be disseminated. So if you do want to know, as soon as they are available, you can always follow our page. We have a Facebook page called Deaf Yes, and that is the Center for Empowerment and Recovery. So we tend to post a lot on there about our research and any updates.
And just to be clear, the video that we showed you today is part of the Seeking Safety. That's the tool where we've created an adaptation called Signs of Safety as part of the Seeking Safety toolkit. And that is not necessarily CBT, it's its own EBT. Mm-hmm.
So someone was wondering, are there any evidence-based therapies that are particularly helpful in engaging a deaf client?
So one of the reasons that we picked the Seeking Safety as our base model was that it does teach many coping skills. It's very easy to learn, very easy to understand. It also provides a lot of psychoeducation related to trauma and addiction. It really emphasizes, power differential and recognizing the therapist's own privilege. So we felt that that was a really important approach, just considering all of, pieces of working with the deaf community and making sure that, it's simple, not heavy on the English. So I'll allow Alex to talk about the piece about addressing or being a good fit for deaf people in general.
Right, I've been looking at adapting motivational interviewing or MET, motivational enhancement therapy. And I'm hoping that that would help address the power disparity that we've been talking about, and the experience that deaf people have in therapy. It can increase the awareness by the provider and the resources that are available.
So I think those two, as far as EBTs, are the two that we're truly trying to employ and adapt for the deaf community.
I know it's at 1. Is it all right if I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So someone was interested about principle number 3. Can you explain a bit more about what you mean about using storytelling and narrative? Someone also wonders about the confidentiality if the client starts to talk about peers as well.
So to start with the question related to storytelling. So one way to use storytelling is to try to find, different videos that are already available online. Many deaf people on Facebook will post and tell their own stories. So taking a look at some of those, seeing what's available what looks beneficial, and then presenting it that way to your client. So how we leverage the storytelling is really, through that 12 series video set that we have, our soap opera. And it's not just one person talking about their story, as you can see. We really wrote this script with 4 characters, and we follow their story over time. We see their struggle. We see them relapse. We see them later work their way up and have successful recovery. And so the whole while we're teaching those really important concepts from seeking safety in that curriculum, but making sure that it's in a storytelling format to be accessible. The second part of that question about the peer approach and confidentiality, this actually is a big concern because the deaf community is very small. An example would be that I just started setting up my first deaf therapy group, and right now it is exceedingly small. A lot of people are concerned about joining the group because they are afraid that their private information will get out. A lot of deaf people, know each other in the community, and word spreads fast, especially with technology the way it is today. It might have been in the old days that word just got around town. Now it can go international very quickly. So we just do our best to emphasize and re-emphasize the importance of confidentiality, respecting each other, and that's what we can do.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Wilkins. We really appreciate your time today. The webinar and the slides will be posted on iSpark's website. Look for it in a week or two. There's a survey that will pop up after the webinar. We'd really appreciate your feedback. If you can take a minute to fill that out. And be on the lookout for future webinars from us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.